What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Baada Summit podcast. My name is Kiprona Leting, the host of the show. And today, our guest is Ted Callahan. Ted is a mountain guide. He's climbed for 30 years. He's guided for 20 years. He's summited Everest, the highest mountain in the world, summited Makalu, the fifth highest mountain in the world. He's done 4 of the 7 summits. The 7 summits are the highest mountains in each continent. So the 4 are Everest, Aconcagua, Elbrus, and Kilimanjaro, of course. Yep. So 3 more left.
Maybe, yeah.
So, and he's also, when he's not climbing, an anthropologist. And short story, how we met, I had just finished my Everest base camp trek in Nepal. So I was just there in the airport, just waiting to board the plane from Lukla to Kathmandu. And then someone, Ted, he approaches me and asks, are you Kenyan or Tanzanian, right? And then I was like, how did you know that? And then that's when you revealed you read the writings on my hoodie.
Yeah, it said Chamuhimuni Summit.
Yeah. So since then, that was last year, November, I think.
But the reason wasn't the sweatshirt. There aren't a ton of black guys running around in Lukla, Nepal either. So, you know,
clearly.
I saw you walking the day before, and then at the airport, I saw you there with the hoodie, and I was glad we caught up, man.
Oh, okay. So you saw me the day before.
I saw you walking down from the airport. I was at a guest house just kind of under the main path. So I saw you walk by, and I was like, oh, okay.
Okay.
I don't see too many guys here.
And we've kept in touch ever since. And you live in Kenya.
Yeah, so my wife lives and works here, and so this is kind of my base for my various forays around. But, I mean, Kenya's awesome. I love it here, and really hope to stick around for quite a while.
Okay, so you're a mountain guide, right?
Yep.
You work for the Mountain Madness company.
I do, yeah. So since 2000, I've worked for Mountain Madness, which is a guide service based out of Seattle, Washington. And they're probably best known, for better or worse, for the 1996 disaster on Mount Everest, in which the founder of Mountain Madness, Scott Fisher, died. But no clients, but just Scott. But yeah, since then I've been kind of guiding around the world for Mountain Madness. And I'm just, at the moment, really, really happy to call Kenya home.
Oh, nice. So before climbing, how did you get into climbing?
I just had some friends in high school who were into it. And so we would basically just climb up trees and rappel or abseil down. And then that kind of led to climbing up rocks. And, from rocks, we started moving up to mountains, and kind of just the progressions continued. So after roughly 20 years of climbing, I figured if I ever wanted to do an 8,000 meter peak, it was time, because I wasn't getting any younger. And so 2017, I had a great opportunity to go back to Nepal, a place I'd been going to for 25 years, and did my first 8,000 meter peak. And I have to say, it's addictive. I was hooked, and went back the next year and climbed Everest. And then COVID, like everything else, interrupted a lot of plans. But we're kind of hoping to get back on track, this year or next year, and back to Nepal and do some more climbing.
So your first 8,000 peak, that was Makalu.
It was, yeah.
So today's topic, we'd like to cover, let's say, climbing 8,000 meter mountains. So maybe we could start what are the basics? How do we prepare for that? And then, of course, now we'll get to your experience. And
It really varies. I mean, the general trend over the past, let's say, 20 years has been people with less experience start out. So you might have somebody who's never put crampons on showing up at Everest Base Camp to climb Everest. Whereas, in the 1990s or before, you'd basically spend almost a lifetime of kind of apprentice climbing, building up to that. You do 4,000 meter peaks, then 5,000, then 6, then 7, then maybe you do a low 8,000 meter peak like Choyo-Yu from the Tibet side. And eventually you'd get to Everest. And that was always kind of the crowning point of a Himalayan career. Nowadays, it's very different. Nowadays, a lot of people just kind of, maybe their careers begin and end with Mount Everest. That might be the first and only peak they climb. In part, that's just due to the kind of commercialization of 8,000 meter climbing, especially on Everest, because that's the peak that people want to climb. If you ask somebody naming out the 8,000 meter peak, the only one most people are going to be able to name is most likely Mount Everest.
Yeah.
So it has the name recognition, and of course, it's the highest peak. So, people want to do it.
So like as a mountain guide, do you have like a structure that you'd like people to follow? So for example, someone listening, Kenyan there, is like, has done Mount Kenya, has done Kilimanjaro, and then they want to step up to Everest.
Yeah, it really varies on the person. I mean, look, like any of us could probably send a check to somebody in Nepal right now and get on a plane tomorrow and start climbing Everest. It's almost that simple. But the analogy I use is, look, you can get in a boat and go sailing without knowing how to swim, and you're probably fine. But if the boat capsizes, you're screwed. So I kind of view mountaineering the same way of like, you can go up with no experience and be on these mountains. And look, that's one of the beautiful things about mountaineering is it's a completely democratic process. It's like being able to play in the World Cup, never having kicked a football around before. But at the same time, there are consequences for that. And so my advice is do try to build up to it. You guys have some great training grounds here in Africa, Mount Kenya, Kilimanjaro, the Ruwenzoris, and then just tons of high altitude trekking areas as well. And I think just getting those miles under your belt really, really pays off because your experience helps up there. Because if everything goes your way, if everything goes right, if the weather's good, you don't have any problems, you don't really need much experience on Everest. But like we saw on K2 in 2008, when the Serac collapsed on the route, took out the fixed routes, and a bunch of the climbers were on the other side, and none of them could figure out how to get back because a lot of them weren't actual mountaineers. And 11 people died that year. And to me, that kind of shows the perils of going up on these peaks without the requisite experience. Because when things go good, you're probably fine, but when things go bad, they go bad real fast up there.
So for experience, that is climbing high mountains, some knowledge using the rope.
Yeah, so generally on every 8,000 meter peak these days, and even lower ones, the Sherpas will go and fix ropes, which basically means just laying a rope between two anchor points. And the ropes are going to be, probably you'll have like 90 meters between anchor points, and you're always connected to a rope from pretty much when you step on the glacier to the summit to when you get back down. So you need to know those basic techniques, which aren't very hard to learn. But I think more kind of personally is, how do you react yourself to altitude? Because everybody's different. Some people do really well. Some people really struggle. So just kind of knowing how your particular physiology works with altitude. And some people are never going to climb 8,000 meter peaks just because their bodies aren't geared for it. They do really badly up there. They don't acclimatize. They don't handle the cold very well. Other people do great, but you need to have a little bit of kind of knowledge of yourself and your abilities to go up. But these days, I would say it's a much more fast-tracked apprenticeship. So it's pretty rare to find somebody who's going to spend, 20 years building up to an 8,000 meter peak. But that said, I think, getting some high altitude experience, and it could be on something as easy as Aconcagua, which is 6,961 meters, so just shy of 7,000. And it's no more difficult than climbing up Kilimanjaro. It's a walk, not a climb. But that said, you're going to spend time moving up to different camps. You're going to spend time sleeping at altitude. You're going to be dealing with a fairly extreme cold environment. And you'll have a pretty good sense after something like that of how you do. So that would be one point, developing some altitude experience. The second one I would say is getting some time on big glaciers. And that's unfortunately the one thing that you can't really do in Africa anymore. So at that point, you could go to, parts of the U.S.
Fine enough?
That glacier's a little small, I think, these days. You'd want to get on something where that's heavily crevassed, so that if you do fall in a crevasse, you know how to get out of it, or how to get your partners out of it. Because even on a fixed rope, you can fall in a crevasse and go in pretty deep. So, the easiest way is you go to Nepal and you do like maybe a 6,000 meter peak there, because that's going to be a heavily glaciated peak, probably not technical, but it's also going to have fixed ropes. So for somebody interested in, say, doing Everest or another 8,000 meter peak, a great thing to do would be to go to Nepal and do like Lobuche East or Island Peak, Mera Peak, any of those. And they're all in the 6,000 meter peak range. They're relatively affordable. And at that point, you would get probably both the altitude and the mountaineering experience that you'd want to have before trying to do more ambitious objectives.
Yeah, so like dealing with the altitude, some people take medication. What's your opinion on that?
So everybody carries medication if they have illnesses, but a lot of people also take some medications prophylactically, so before they climb. And the two main ones are going to be acetazolamide, which is known as Diamox, and that just basically changes the pH of your blood so that you start dealing with the altitude a bit better. And everybody takes that. So if you, say, don't sleep well, or you have a really bad headache that won't go away with hydration and rest, then you're probably starting to develop the symptoms of AMS, acute mountain sickness. So you take some Diamox, and it generally will resolve those symptoms. Some people take it before they go to altitude just so they don't have to go through that process. That's pretty standard. What's a bit more controversial is taking another drug called dexamethasone, which is a steroid. And a lot of people do that in the Himalaya. But it's not like cycling. People aren't doping up there. The only real performance-enhancing drug that you have at altitude that people take is oxygen. And I'll say, like, whenever it comes up and that I've climbed Everest, the first question people ask is, "Oh, did you do it on oxygen?" Which is great, but it's basically saying like, "Oh, you ran a marathon. Did you run sub 3 hours?" It's like, well, no, I'm a middle-aged, out-of-shape white guy. Like, of course I didn't run it in sub 3 hours. I ran it in 5 hours, So it's the same thing with 8,000 meter peaks. Is like almost everybody, regular guys like me who've climbed it, are going to do it with oxygen.
Okay.
But let's be clear, oxygen is a performance-enhancing drug.
It is.
I believe so, yeah. I mean, look, you carry it on Kilimanjaro so that if you do develop some illness, you have it with you and you can administer it. But in the Himalaya, almost on all 8,000 meter peaks nowadays, and certainly Everest, everybody basically goes on oxygen at around 7,500 meters and stays on it to the summit and comes down as far as they can before they run out.
Okay, so let's talk about your Everest experience. So which route did you use? Which year was this?
So I did Everest in 2018, and that was, we did it from the north side, so the Tibet-Chinese side. So the way you generally do that is you can do it two ways. You can fly to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and then drive across the Tibetan plateau, or you can fly to Kathmandu and then drive up, cross the border, and then get on the plateau and drive. Generally speaking, it's a bit better to start at Kathmandu and drive because then you're starting low and gaining altitude, whereas Lhasa is already pretty high. Forget, it's like 2,000 some meters. It's very, very high. So a lot of people get sick at Lhasa when they arrive. And the Tibetan plateau is just that. It's a plateau. So once you get sick up there, there's no getting down. You have to basically leave Tibet at that point. So you take a bit of a risk by going straight to the plateau. So anyway, we flew into Kathmandu and we drove up. It took about 3 days of driving to get to base camp. And that's the big difference one of the big differences between the north and south sides of Everest is on the south side from Nepal, you spend about 10 days trekking to base camp, which is about 5,300 meters. On the north side in Tibet, you drive to base camp, and it's a bit lower. It's about 5,150 meters.
Okay. And it's very easy for someone to get sick.
Well, if you just jump into it, it is. But if you do a kind of progressive drive like we did, where you go up from Kathmandu, which is quite low, to 3,000 meters, to 4,000 meters, to 5,000 meters, and then drive to base camp.
How long was the drive?
It's about 3 days total.
Okay. So you reach base camp. So how is it there, the base camp?
It's interesting. I mean, you're not on a glacier at base camp. You're at the terminal moraine of the glacier. So you're camped on just this big pile of rocks. Because you're driving there, it's pretty comfortable. So whereas in Nepal, everything has to be brought up to base camp, whether by yak or porter or helicopter, in Tibet, trucks drive up and drop everything off. So you generally eat a bit better. It's easier to get food up there. you have a bit more creature comforts, you have bigger tents, you might have like a movie screen, like a screen you pull down and a projector for watching films because you're going to spend a lot of time in base camp. Definitely the beer doesn't run out as quickly in Tibet as it does in Nepal. It's a lot cheaper, so that's an advantage of climbing from the Tibet side. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward process to get to base camp. The disadvantage, though, is that you're very, very far from the rest of the climbing route. So on Everest North, there's base camp and then there's advanced base camp. And the distance between the two is about 25 kilometers, and it's about 1,200 meter gain. So that's a very, very rough.
It's gentle.
It's fairly gentle. You're going up glacier the whole way, but it's generally a dry glacier, so you don't have to be roped up. But it makes for a really long day. I mean, the first couple times you do it, you break it up. You don't do it at once, but then on your final push, before you're on your way up to the summit, you generally do it all in one go, and it takes about 8 hours.
So for your trip, how was the structure of it? Like, how many days had you scheduled for the climb?
I think we had scheduled about 45 days in total, and that's one of the things that's really changed with Himalayan climbing, let's say in the past decade, is historically, like if you had gone on a commercial trip to Everest in 2005, it would have been 60 days at least, door to door, from when you left home to when you flew home. And you would have spent a lot of time acclimatizing high up on the mountain and then coming down to base camp or even descending below base camp. Nowadays, we know some things we didn't know back then, one of which is the body just doesn't acclimatize above really 8,000 meters. And any time above 7,000 meters really just wears you down. So what you want to do ideally is minimize the time you actually spend at high altitude. So let's say anything above 7,000 meters. And one reason for that is almost everybody's going to go on oxygen from 7,500 meters up. So all you really need to do is be able to acclimatize up to 7,000 meters. And then from that point, you'll be on oxygen very quickly as you're walking up. So our trip, we did it 30 days door to door from Kathmandu.
Oh.
And from the day we arrived in base camp till the day we came down from the summit, it was 25 days.
So you scheduled for 45, but did in 25.
Yep.
Wow. So
Yeah, and the dangerous thing is then if you don't have a refundable ticket on your way back, you spend 2 weeks in Kathmandu drunk the whole time.
So like out of the 25 days, how many days do you spend at the base camp? Like how are the rotations that's climbing up and down?
Yeah, I mean, without I won't do a day by day, blow by blow, because that would be boring. But essentially, you get there, you rest for a few days, and then you walk up to the interim camp between base camp and advanced base camp, sleep there, go up to advanced base camp, sleep there, come all the way down. Then you spend like 5 days back in base camp, allowing your body to recuperate from the effort and acclimatize to that altitude, because advanced base camp is around 6,350 meters. And then once you're feeling pretty good, then you basically do another rotation back up. A lot of people then do climb up to Camp 1. So advanced base camp, 6,300 meters. Camp 1 is 7,000 meters. And that's fine. That's definitely advisable to do. What people make a mistake, and they do it on either side of the mountain, is then they'll try to spend 2-3 nights, either consecutively or total over a few attempts, at Camp 1. Camp 1's 7,000 meters. It's not a nice place. It's cold. It kicks your ass being up there. So when you come down, essentially every day you spend up on there, every night you spend up on there, your body needs 1 to 2 nights to recover from that. And you often don't have that. So just long story short is when we were up, the highest I'd gone was advanced base camp. And then I came down, then we were going back up for a rotation. I didn't think I needed to go back up. So I actually came back down, stayed at base camp for 2 nights. The rest of the trip went up to Camp 1. One guy got sick with altitude, had to get evacuated. The rest went up to 1, came back down, and then we were told that the Chinese were going to close the mountain for the season and that we had to go up. So whereas I'd had 3 days sitting around base camp recuperating, these guys came down from Camp 1 and literally had 1 night before they had to go back up. And they were whipped. You could just see their bodies hadn't recovered. And whereas I hadn't been as high as they had, I had allowed myself the time to recover. So I was incredibly faster than they were, and I felt a lot better all the way to the top.
So from the base camp till the summit, how many camps are there?
There's 3 camps on the north side, and there's 4 on the south side.
Okay.
And so the camps on the north side is Camp 1, as I mentioned, is 7,000 meters. Camp 2 is around 7, 8. Camp 3 is 8.2. And so that's basically the highest place on any mountain that you sleep regularly, is kind of designated camp. But the nice thing is then when you get up, well, you don't really sleep, but when you get ready to go, you have a fairly not easy, but a fairly straightforward summit day, because you're only going from 8.2 to roughly 8,900 meters. Whereas on the south side of Everest, I forget the exact elevation of the South Col, but you end up with roughly a 900-meter summit day, which is a lot more taxing. So the trade-off is on the north side, you sleep a lot higher, but then you have a shorter climb to the summit. Yeah. Whereas on the south side, you sleep lower, which is fine, but then you have a much longer climb to the summit.
So once you select the date for the summit push, you start at base camp, and then you just go all the way to the top?
Yeah, I mean, climbing Everest is in a lot of ways, it's like an engineering problem. Okay. Basically, you're just waiting for the right weather forecast, and you're calculating how much oxygen you're going to consume, and therefore how many bottles of oxygen you need. And those are 2 of the, I mentioned there's been some changes in how we approach high-altitude mountaineerings in recent years, and those are 2 of the big changes. One is the weather forecasts have gotten incredibly sophisticated. So most groups hire a professional forecasting service, and they are so good that they can say, okay, tomorrow at 10 p.m., the winds are going to drop down to 0 or to 10 kilometers an hour. And it's going to be like that for 6 hours, and then they're going to pick back up again starting at a certain time. So you guys need to be at Camp 3, ready to go to the summit at this particular time to get that window of low winds. So it's that specific. So it really makes it possible to kind of plan your trips almost to the hour for the summit. The second big change is the oxygen systems that you use. So the masks, the cylinders are lighter, but basically the masks just do a lot better job of delivering oxygen. So you lose less of the bottled oxygen that you're breathing in, and the whole thing is just much more efficient. So that's kind of allowed the whole process to be condensed into, like I said, like a 25 or 30-day period like we did it in.
How many bottles does one need for oxygen?
That is a great question, and it really depends on flow rate. So without boring your listeners too much, a bottle of oxygen holds 960 liters of oxygen. So to make the math simple, a kind of high flow rate when you're climbing with oxygen is 4 liters a minute. And that means 1 bottle is going to last you 4 hours. And that's kind of the standard figure. So what happens is, generally speaking, on Everest, people will use about 5 bottles of oxygen, top to bottom. Some people use more, some use less. As the commercialization of Everest has kind of gone on and you end up with kind of less fit, less experienced climbers, a lot of companies now offer 8 liters per minute of oxygen, which is an insanely high flow. But simple math tells you that means 1 bottle is going to last 2 hours. So what that also means is each bottle is 3.5 kilograms. Generally speaking, you only carry the one that you're breathing off of at the time. So you need extra Sherpas to carry your extra oxygen. So if you want to spend about $100,000 US, what you'll get is essentially 8 bottles of oxygen and 2 Sherpas to carry them up for you.
Well, what's a typical budget for an Everest trip?
It really varies. So the low end of Everest, I mean, essentially if you factor in permit costs and everything, it's about $20,000 to even set foot on Everest. Just to walk past base camp towards the mountain. Then if you want base camp services, add $5,000. If you want oxygen, add roughly $2,000 to $3,000 per bottle. And it goes up from there. So a basic trip where you're sort of self-guided, but you still have some of these services will cost around $45,000, where a trip where you might have a guide kind of climbing with you, not just a Sherpa carrying oxygen, but an actual guide who's been trained, that's around $65,000. And then, as I mentioned, these kind of high-end trips where you basically are just given more or less unlimited oxygen, $100,000 and up from there.
And this is minus gear.
Oh yeah, no, you minus your flight over, minus your gear and everything. That's just, they pick you up at the airport and then drop you off after the trip.
What's like the budget for gear like?
I think most people probably by that point, if they've done a progression, have their own gear. So it's not like you just show up and go and drop $5,000 worth of money on gear. But yeah, like the key things that you're going to need are really, really good boots, which will cost anywhere from $500 to $800. Very specialized boots. And you know, just to your listeners, like, please don't skimp on your boots, because it's not worth losing toes up on Everest to save a couple $100. So I would almost say that's your most important piece of kit, is a really, really good pair of boots that you've worn a lot, you've broken in. Then you have to have a down suit.
Yeah.
Down suit's going to cost about the same, about $600-700, but you can easily spend upwards of $1,000 on a kind of custom, tailored, super 1,000-filled down suit. You know, mountaineers are just gearheads. You know, we love to buy stuff, and so the companies aren't stupid. So, you know, it's like a crack dealer. You know, like, they'll just, like, you want the more expensive drugs, they'll give it to you. You know? So they've gotten, you know, all these fancy things that you can spend your money on. But realistically, good boots, a good down suit, and then the rest of the stuff is pretty basic. You know, you need some intermediate layers. Good gloves, obviously, are really important, and several types, because conditions change and you want to have the right gloves. You know, you have down mitts for the summit climb, then you have insulated gloves for intermediate, you have light gloves for base camp, etc. And then the rest of the stuff, you don't need much hardware, so that's pretty basic. A lot of people make the mistake when climbing Everest of bringing a negative 40 degrees Celsius bag up with them.
A sleeping bag.
A sleeping bag, exactly. And the fact is, you're sleeping in a down suit that is basically a sleeping bag you're wearing. So what most people who are a bit more experienced do is bring a much lighter bag, like, let's say, like a -5 Celsius bag, 20 degree Fahrenheit roughly, bag, and use that because you're in your down suit.
Okay. So, like, you have the weather window. You've been told, reach Camp 3 at a certain date. You need to summit at this certain date. So how is the summit push like from the last camp to the summit?
So the summit push is wild, because on either side of the mountain, part of your peak fees for Everest go towards paying the rope fixing team.
Yeah.
So on the north, it's a group of Tibetans. On the south, it's a group of Nepalese Sherpa. And their job is basically to, on the south side, fix the route through the ice fall, and then to the summit. On the north side, it's just from where you step onto the glacier outside of Advanced Base Camp to the summit. So they basically provide all this 5 or 6 millimeter rope and thousands of meters of it all the way to the top. And so it takes them a little while. Generally speaking, in a given year, they're going to wait until around early to mid-May to fix the route to the summit. What happens to a lot of people, and this is one reason why you should never go too early to an 8,000 meter peak, is they're sitting in base camp and they've lost their damn minds. You know, they've just been sitting there bored. You know, they're reading their emails. I got to get home. You know, little Jimmy's sick. I got something at work. So they're unfocused on the mountain. They're like, look, I want to summit this damn thing and get off. And so they follow the rope fixing team to the top. The minute the ropes are fixed, you will have hundreds of people cramming up trying to get to the summit. And those shit show photos you've seen of lines of people to the summit, that's what's happening, is they've basically slipstreamed behind the rope fixing teams. They want to get up and get the hell out of there. A much better thing is you just kind of wait, let that initial crush go, and then go. So for example, when we did it, we waited a few days. So everybody summited after the rope fixing team did. Then there was a couple days of high winds, kind of bad weather, so nobody was summiting. And then we had the weather window. The forecast was good. So then we said, okay, let's go up. And then, of course, the Chinese said, look, you better get up there or we're going to throw you out of China because season's over. So we didn't have a choice, but luckily that coincided with the weather window. And off we went up to the top. And pretty much from Camp 2, Camp 3, and on the summit, we were the only team. So when we summited, we had it to ourselves. There was nobody else up there. So the basic thing is you get up, you kind of figure out, okay, we've got the weather window, we've got the oxygen pre-positioned, we've got the equipment pre-positioned. At that point, the biggest variable is how are you doing?
Yeah.
Are you healthy? Because if you have a cold, if you have any sort of respiratory infection, you're not going to make it up, most likely. Some people do, and they're able to push through it, but we had a guy who was coughing so hard at base camp, he broke his ribs.
Just from a cough?
Just from a cough. I mean, he would cough for 20 minutes straight and couldn't stop. It was that bad. And so there was no way he was going to go any higher, and so he left. But yeah, so you push up once you kind of figure out you've got the health, the weather window, and everything in position. And so we went straight up to, as I mentioned, to advanced base camp, had a rest day there, went up to Camp 1. We slept on a very, very low flow of oxygen that night, like half a liter a minute. Then we started pushing up to Camp 2. Halfway up, we went on to full oxygen at around 2 liters a minute, stayed on that flow while we slept at 2. And just to put this in perspective, from advanced base camp to Camp 1 is roughly 4 hours. From Camp 1 to 2 took us about 5 hours. From 2 to 3 took us about 4 hours. And then you get to 3, and then you're basically sleeping in the most amazing place in the world. You got this view of the west ridge of Everest. You're looking down into the Khumbu Valley. You can turn around and look back over the Tibetan Plateau. I'll say the sad thing about Everest is how irresponsible mountaineers are. And I'm not blaming anybody else. I didn't carry my shit down from Everest either, but when you get to Camp 3, there's all these tents that have just been left there because people don't want to take them down. So we didn't even carry a tent to Camp 3. We just knew there would be so many abandoned tents. We would just pile in one of those.
Do people usually take it down?
Nope. They're just left there. They just get shredded by the wind, and then they get carried down to the Rungbuk Glacier and destroyed that way. But no, I mean, all the camps on Everest are completely trashed. They're filled with empty, not so much oxygen bottles because those are valuable, but they're filled with trash, with shit, with destroyed tents. Yeah, none of us have done a very good job of being stewards of the high mountains, I have to say. But anyway, so you're up at Camp 3, and you don't sleep at that elevation. And especially when our Sherpas decided that, we should all go at 8:30 at night to the summit because there was a forecast that we didn't have a forecast. We saw some weather we thought was moving in, so we decided it would be better. So my whole climb occurred at night. So all my photos are just, blackness.
It's the dark.
Yeah. So, you hear everybody saying, it was the best view of my life, and I didn't see anything. So I guess I'll have to go back one day.
So Camp 3, you left at 8:30 at night.
Yeah. And
summited at...
Yeah, we summited at 1:30, so it took us 5 hours to get up.
At night?
At night, yeah. And on the North Ridge, it's just that. It's a ridge climb. So basically, it's objectively pretty safe. There's no avalanche danger. There's not much rockfall danger. The biggest danger is the altitude up there. And so everybody asks, and yeah, there's quite a few dead bodies up there. The Chinese have done a bit of gardening and kind of, moved some out of the way. But, I remember kind of plopping down onto this really flat kind of big rock and leaning back, and there was something behind me, and it felt pretty comfortable to lean back on it. And then I looked, and it was a blue tarp, and I was wondering why a blue tarp was there, and lifted it up, and then I saw like a frozen hand sticking out. So put the tarp back, got up, and kept going. There was a Sherpa who had died the night before we went up, and he was sitting there with his headlamp on still. So that was pretty freaky, just walking by that guy sitting there with his headlamp looking down the valley. The last thing I guess he ever saw was that. So it's a little spooky.
So like when you're walking, what's on your mind at that time? You're seeing like this?
I don't know what other people, I just think of like, I'm shit scared and I really need to maintain my focus and I want to get the hell off this mountain as quickly as possible. Just because a lot of the people die coming down, statistically speaking, you're much more likely to die on the way down than you are on the way up because of fatigue, because you run out of oxygen, whatever it is. So, for me, actually, those were helpful reminders that, hey, I'm not in my little, because my world there was an oxygen mask in the beam of my headlamp and my own thoughts. So it was very easy to kind of think about emails or, just sort of drift off a little bit over the course of 5 hours because you can't talk to anybody. You're wearing an oxygen mask, you're sort of using hand signals the whole way. And let's be honest, it's climbing at night's kind of boring. It wasn't like I was seeing the sunrise over, the Tibetan Plateau. I was just staring in blackness. So it was a good reminder that, hey, this is real and we better keep our shit together as we're going up.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we kept going and, you can't really climb as a group because people move at different speeds. The only person who's going to stay with you is basically the Sherpa who's assigned to you because that guy is carrying your extra oxygen.
Yeah.
And you guys are kind of buddies, so you check his level to see how he's doing. He checks yours because what you don't want to do is run out of oxygen because the effect is immediate. The minute you run out of oxygen, and this happened to me on Makalu, it's suddenly like you just chugged like a half liter of vodka. Like you lose your coordination, your focus, and it's immediate. And on Makalu, somebody noticed luckily that I was stumbling around and checked, and my oxygen bottle was empty, so they switched it, and immediately I was fine again. But so on Everest, because you're on a ridge, you don't want to fall off, so you keep a close eye on each other, and it just makes sense to climb as buddies. But yeah, so Pemba and I got to the top at 1:30. Little bit of a sidebar story there is we're wearing our down suits. It wasn't very cold. My pictures show me wearing pretty light liner gloves. But I guess at some point, either from the start or along the way, I had my fly down on my down suit. And so when we got to the final summit plateau and the last 50 meters to the summit, then we hit a wind coming at us. And that's when I realized I had froze my emboro. And so I kind of had to stop and deal with that. And then he thought I was taking a piss on the summit, and he was quite upset because the gods live up there. I'm just meanwhile warming my junk up. But anyway, we kind of had that conversation afterwards when we got back down. But yeah, we got up to the summit and couldn't see a damn thing because it was 1:30 in the morning. And we spent a half hour up there taking photos, opening prayer flags. And then at that point, you realize it's time to go down.
How is the feeling like reaching the top?
For me, I think it's probably different if you can see something and it's inspiring. For me, all I could think of was I had seen the anchors that the fixed ropes were attached to on the way up and how dodgy some of those were. And all I could remember thinking is I'm about to put all my weight onto a single piton that's halfway out of the rock. And if it pulls, I'm going to fall 4,000 meters to the glacier. And just being kind of terrified and like, look, I can't enjoy this because I know that going down is going to be so much scarier than coming up. Because when you go up, look, you're connected to the ropes, but sometimes you're kind of pulling on the rope. A lot of the times you're just connected to it in case you fall, but you're walking by and large. On the way down, you're often just abseiling completely on these ropes, or at least putting all your weight on it as you hand rappel down. If that rope fails or the anchor fails, it might hold. Probably not, though. So it's pretty scary going down. And I think that's again maybe experience talking. Is if you don't understand anchors and fixed ropes and things, you just think, oh, it's kind of like an amusement park. I go up, I go down, everything's great. But if you can kind of look at these things and evaluate them, you realize like, shit, man, this is really not safe.
So because now it's not safe, you're like, does it freak you out a bit?
We were just very focused going down, I would say. I mean, there were only two of us. There was 4 more people from our party were coming up behind us, but they were an hour behind us. The guys who had gone ahead of us were already past us. So, it was literally just the two of us there. And, if either of us had a problem, it was only going to be, the other guy who could help you with it.
Yeah.
And so you realize you don't have a huge margin of error up there. So there's no fucking about. Like, it's just, hey, we've gotten to where we wanted to go. We've got our photos. We've unfrozen our dicks, and now it's time to go back down. And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah, I'd be worried too if that happened. So if anything happens, let's say at that high altitude, people normally leave each other.
It really depends. I mean, if it's an accident, then, somebody might try to do something to help. If it's altitude related, there's very little you can do. So up there, you're carrying injectable dexamethasone, which is a very powerful steroid you use for cerebral edema. Basically, your brain swells and it's pressing against the skull, and you start to have essentially symptoms of a brain injury, because that's in a way what it is. So what you might do is inject your partner with Dex.
Okay.
And it generally, if it's going to work quickly. So they'll go from basically lying there comatose to back up. If it doesn't work, you're screwed. They're done, And it's often in conjunction with them running out of oxygen. So if they're out of oxygen and there's no more oxygen, essentially your Sherpa, if it's a client, your Sherpa has to decide, do I want to die up here with this person. Because I mean, the Sherpas are amazingly good at altitude, but they're not superhuman, you know? So if a Sherpa takes his oxygen off, gives it to his client up there, he's now going to have a massively reduced performance and probably succumb to altitude before too long as well. So, you know, at that point, yeah, it's kind of understood that, hey, we're a team until we're not.
Yeah.
And that's why I often say, look, like, you know, you can't be selfish up there, because this is a guy who's getting paid to do this. The Sherpas aren't, it's changed a bit, but by and large, Sherpas aren't up there because it's fun for them or they want to do it. It's a job. Like mountain guides kind of in most places. And, you know, the more you screw around up there, the more you put that guy's life at risk. And that's why a lot of companies won't allow people on their trips to try to climb without oxygen, because the Sherpa's on oxygen, because he wants it, because he doesn't want to lose fingers or toes to frostbite.
Yeah.
He wants to be able to move fast. But the client who's on oxygen is going to be moving at half his speed. And a lot of companies just say, look, you know what, this is a huge hassle. So I always say, look, climbing without oxygen is a massive achievement. Great if you can do it, but leave it to the professionals.
Yeah. So like with all these risks involved in climbing these mountains, I know like you're a guide. Why do you climb?
Wasn't hugged enough as a child? I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I wish I could distill it into some sort of pithy, because it's there kind of Mallory-esque quote, but I just love it. I've been going to Nepal for 25 years. And for me, every time it's like a homecoming, you know, going to Kathmandu and seeing old friends. And most of the Sherpas I climb with, I've been climbing with for, you know, the better part of 5 or 10 years. So, you know, they're friends. You know, and the kind of community of non-Nepalese climbers and guides, like we've all been going there for ages. So it's kind of just a reunion. Everybody gets together, you know, once or twice a year and sees each other. And it's a hell of a lot of fun. Yeah. And, you know, people complain about base camp being boring and sitting around. I think it's great. You know, I smuggled in 1 year's worth of Economist magazines into China, and I read all of them. And I would never have time.
Oh, it's illegal there.
Yeah, they found all the ones they found in my carry-on bag. They made me throw away.
Okay.
But we had buried some in a food barrel, so those made it in. But yeah, you sit in base camp and you have nothing to do. You know, okay, you might have, you know, a wireless connection, so you can do some email, but it's just a great chance to kind of unplug from the world. And I always say, look, like if you're going to do one of these trips, you have to kind of embrace, you know, not just the climbing, but the downtime as well.
Yeah.
And all of us lead pretty busy, kind of hyper-connected lives, and it's really cool to just kind of have like a month where, you know, hey, you can sleep as long as you want, you can get up whenever you want, you might not have anything to do for 5 days in base camp other than kind of just walk around and move a bit. And I think it's fun. And, you know, look, there's booze, you're drinking, you're having parties, it's a good time. You know, there's some people
5,000 meters.
Yeah, I mean, we had a bar fight in base camp when we were there. One of the guys on our team started a brawl, and it was like a bench clear. Everybody got up and started throwing fists, and you know, and wasn't what I was expecting, but everybody kind of made up the next day. We had a lot of fun, so
some entertainment.
So it's just kind of the whole package, and then and then it's the climbing, and then what's fun is you go from kind of the downtime in base camp to, you know, the utter focus that you have on the mountain. And, you know, without making it too dramatic, I think, you know, our lives are pretty safe, pretty simple. You know, like we can make mistakes and recover from them. We can, you know, send a stupid tweet and kind of, you know, figure out a way to back it up a bit or something, or, you know, whatever it is. And up there, your actions have consequences. Yeah. And it's one of those rare moments in life where in our kind of modern, generally safe lives, where like what you do kind of determines whether you're going to live or die up there. And nobody but you is the person who's going to decide that.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty unique these days. And, you know, you read the magazines, you see what people are doing, and you have to go pretty far and try pretty hard to get that degree of kind of, you know, accountability. And lastly, I'll just say it's a great form of self-discovery. You know, you learn about, you know, what you are as a person up there. You know, a bit about your bravery, a bit about your tolerance for risk, a bit about your tolerance for complete boredom. You know, just kind of who you are. And again, I think that's not something we find very often in our lives. And, you know, speaking personally for me, that is where I find it, is up in Nepal. So, you know, I love it, and I absolutely plan to keep going back for it.
Cool. Like your Everest climb, that was the north route, right?
Yep.
And right now it's closed to foreigners.
Yeah, so the Chinese, like everything basically was closed in 2020 with COVID during the spring climbing season. And then because China is still pursuing this kind of zero COVID strategy, they haven't reopened it to foreigners ever since. So there's still Chinese expeditions that are going up, but no foreigners have been allowed in there 2020, 2021, or 2022. And it seems like it may continue that way.
What's the main difference between the north and the south?
The main difference, other than the approach, one being a drive, one being a 10-day trek, is the nature of the route. So on the south side, it's largely what we call kind of face climbing. So you're climbing up glaciers. You've got higher peaks on either side that often, seracs collapse or avalanches fall. So there's a lot of objective risk on the south side of Everest. And the one that people know best is the ice fall. So the route between base camp and Camp 1, which is this very unstable jumble of ice blocks and whatnot, some of which are several stories high. There have been some big disasters. So in 2014, there was a serac collapse that killed dozens of Sherpas. 2015, there was the huge avalanche in Nepal that then caused another massive avalanche that took out people in the ice fall and base camp as well. You've got very, very big crevasses on the glaciers between Camp 1 and 2. You've got crevasses and a fairly steep snow climb from Camp 2 to 3. From Camp 3 to 4, you've got a long traversing climb over glaciers that has a bit of avalanche danger. And then on the route, you've still got some other dangers as well. So the North Ridge is actually pretty straightforward on the north side. There's only one section, the climb up to Camp 1, that tends to be avalanche prone. So you just don't do it after snow falls. But the route from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to the summit, it's not threatened by avalanches. It's not threatened by much rock fall. So objectively, it's a lot safer, the route. So I'd say that's the biggest difference.
What about the success rate?
The success rate tends to be higher from the Nepalese side because more people do it. The north side is both steeper and colder because it's the north side, so it's north facing, so it doesn't get as much sun. And just because it is steeper, I think it just messes with people's heads. So on the summit ridge, so from Camp 3 to the summit, you have this thing called there's 3 steps. So 3 kind of difficult rock barriers that you have to climb. So the first step isn't that bad. You kind of scrape up it and you don't even realize you've done it. The second step is the bastard. It's the one that you see pictures of with the ladders. Mm-hmm. So they've got, a 30-foot ladder there, aluminum ladder that you basically have to climb up, to get past this rock corner that's not really possible to climb. Mm-hmm. And so that's intimidating because you look to your right, and if there's any visibility, you can see dead bodies and, like a 4,000 meter foot fall on your right. And so a lot of people panic there. You get bottlenecks because people move slowly. People freeze on the ladders going
Traffic
up or
jam.
down. So it can be a big mess there. So that what I'd say is the big difference in terms of the explaining why the North is a bit more dangerous and thus has a relatively lower success rate. But success rates, I don't know the exact figure, but they're pretty high on Everest these days. I think it's upwards of 60%.
Mm-hmm. So there is a Kenyan that's attempting to summit Everest, KG, James Kagambi. So right now he's at the base camp. What do you think is going through his mind right now?
Good question. I mean, I've climbed with KG in 2015 in the Ruwenzuris of Uganda, so I know he's a completely competent and very experienced climber, and I know he and his team have been preparing extensively for this trip. So I don't have any doubts about their mental preparation and their fitness for it. If KG were to listen to this, I would just say, hey, spend as little time as you can up high. So
up high meaning.
Well, for example, on the south side, don't sleep at Camp 3.
Okay.
Touch Camp 3, but come back down. There's no reason to sleep at Camp 3. It's too high. Mm-hmm. You're going to waste too much time recovering. Take care of yourself in base camp. Don't get sick. Mm-hmm. So much as it is fun to go and hang out with other groups and whatnot, that's also how you often get sick, because somebody's sick. Avoid trekkers like the plague, because they are just like the rats of Everest Base Camp. They bring disease into the camp. and it's hard because you'll get some pretty trekkers coming up who are like, "Ooh, are you climbing
Yeah,
Everest?"
they'd want to see him, yeah.
Yeah, and you're like, "Oh, yeah, matter of fact, I am climbing Everest. We want to see my tent." Not that I ever did that, honey. But so you really have to keep your wits about you. And like I said, because you're there for a month, it's easy to let your guard down and do one stupid thing that, then scuttles your whole chances. So be patient, man. Stay low. Listen to your Sherpas because they know what they're doing, and you'll make it.
Awesome. So KG is James Kagambi. He's part of the Full Circle team. This is an all-black team that is attempting Everest. So yeah, so all the best to him. Go KG and go to the rest of the
go KG.
Full Circle team. So the main take that I've heard is just don't sleep in Camp 3.
If you wanted to put a bumper sticker on this conversation, it's don't sleep at Camp 3. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's just, it's changed. We know things about altitude that we didn't know before. And like I mentioned, there's those $100,000 trips.
Yeah.
Nowadays, because a lot of the expeditions are still kind of old school and still sell it as a 60-day trip, a lot of the new expeditions that have figured out, hey, actually, we don't need to spend 60 days, but hey, let's package it, call it a 30-day flash trip, and charge people twice as much money to do it. And so that's what's happening. So, you look at like a high-end American company like Alpenglow, they're charging about $100,000 to $120,000 for an Everest trip. And essentially what they do is they rent you an oxygen tent that you sleep in for a few months before you go. The idea being that you'll be pre-acclimated when you get there. You'd spend as little time as possible in base camp. So, whereas some teams might have arrived at the beginning of the month, you would go basically to be there just around this time. So you'd be flying into base camp around the 20th or 23rd of April with the goal to being up to the top and out of there by this time next month in May.
End of May.
So, and I think eventually most commercial trips are going to start adopting this model just because it works. You don't need to sleep in an oxygen tent. You don't need to spend $120,000. You just need to use common sense and not kind of waste your time doing stupid stuff like sleeping high, spending way too much time in base camp, which again is just every day in base camp is another chance to get sick or injured, as I kind of saw it. So, the shorter the trip, the better your odds of getting up, by and large, are. And this is all just true for somebody using oxygen. If you're doing an oxygen list, it's a completely different approach. But for 98% of the people on Everest this year who are going to be on oxygen, they would all be well advised to just kind of, minimize their time at altitude up very high and in base camp.
Okay. So I'm sure everyone has their own plans. I hope everything works out for them. And all the best to the Everest climbers for 2022.
Absolutely.
So you've done 2 8,000-meter mountains, Everest and Makalu, right?
Yep.
What's the difference between the two?
They're actually very close to each other. They're in different valley systems, so they have slightly different weather. The difference is Makalu is just, it's a bit steeper. It's a bit more technical because you have like two kind of very steep technical sections on Makalu, the route from Camp 2 to 3, and then the route from Camp 3 to the summit. And it's a very, very long day from Camp 3 to the summit. Most people skip Camp 4. So it's, I think, 1,100 meters up to the top. So it's a really long day. There's a fair bit of avalanche danger. It's just kind of a burlier mountain overall in some ways, at least on the standard climbing route there.
So it's not recommended for someone, let's say, beginner in an 8,000-meter mountain?
No. I mean, these days, so it used to be that Choyo-yu, which is around, I think, 8,200 meters, would be climbed as your first 8,000-meter peak, and you do it from the Chinese side. As we talked about, it's closed now, and it's been closed for 3 years and probably won't reopen anytime soon from the Chinese side. Since that happened, there hasn't been like a really good warm-up 8,000-meter peak. What everybody did once the Chinese closed Choyo-yu is they went to another peak in Nepal called Manaslu. And Manaslu is relatively low. It's 8.1 or 8.2. You still probably, most people do it these days, I believe, on oxygen. But the route is very straightforward. It's more just kind of like, gradual snow climbing. But the problem is it has some very avalanche-prone sections. So there've been a lot of avalanche hazards. It tends to be kind of more on the wet side of the Himalaya, so it tends to get more precipitation even during the post and pre-monsoon seasons. So what in Nepal are the fall and spring seasons. But that's where people are going now to kind of cut their teeth. The problem is, if you look at the 8,000 meter peaks, there aren't a ton that really are good warm-ups. There are a couple in Pakistan, there's Manaslu, and that's really it. So in part for that reason, as I mentioned at the start, that's why a lot of people are just saying, you know what, skip all this crap, I'm just going right up to Everest. But that said, because of the commercialization, it also means there's a lot of peaks that if you are a bit comfortable with expeditionary climbing in Nepal are great because they're not very crowded. So like Annapurna, Dhaulagiri, Kanchenjunga, like these are peaks that are, very, very much, within reach for people with a certain amount of experience, but they're not going to have hundreds of climbers. They might have a couple dozen per season.
So that's good. Let's say there's no traffic, waiting in the cold.
Yeah. You've got it basically to yourself. The downside of a less traffic mountain is you don't have the Sherpa support to put the fixed ropes into the top. Nowadays, there's a company called Seven Summits Treks. It's Nepali owned. They are the dominant 8,000 meter company. And they run trips on every mountain. And what a lot of people do is they look to see, okay, hey, have they sold a trip to, say, Dhaulagiri? Yes, they have. Great. Then that means they're going to send 20 really, really good climbing Sherpas there to fix the route to the top. So we're going to go to Dhaulagiri this year. And we're basically going to give them a bit of money to use their fixed ropes. And it's kind of like I described on Everest. You just wait till they've put the ropes into the top, and then you slipstream behind them and go up.
So the rope fixing team is really crucial.
Yeah, they are. And that's why, for example, K2 is now kind of being has become a commercial peak. It's statistically, it's one of the most dangerous peaks, a bit less than Annapurna and some others, but it's commonly regarded as the most technically difficult peak, just because it has hazards galore, including the bottleneck, which is what fell in 2008 and took out the ropes and resulted in 11 people dying, as I mentioned. But nowadays, because most companies will send a huge team of Sherpas to fix the ropes to the top, it's regarded as as kind of like just a slightly more dangerous Everest climb. So it's really changing the climbing landscape, and it's only going to continue. The commercialization is going to continue. There's no going back. Like Nepal's never going to go back to kind of a hardcore alpinist playground, at least for the big commercial 8,000 meter peak. So if you want to go to Nepal and have it to yourself, climb 6,000, 7,000 meter peaks. But if you're trying to do 8,000 meter peaks on the trade routes, you better be ready for crowds, because that's what you're going to find.
Yeah. So someone who's done a 6,000 meter, 7,000 can just go straight ahead to Everest.
Yeah, I mean, that's what people do. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, like I said, the beauty of mountaineering is it's up to you.
Yeah.
You want to go play in the World Cup for your first game, nobody's going to stop you. And there's a company that will take your money and some are actually pretty good and will give you a decent shot at it. My only hesitation with that is if you just don't have, there's a saying when you start climbing is you have two buckets. One is experience and one is luck.
Yeah.
And basically what you're doing is you're taking rocks out of the luck bucket and putting them in the experience bucket and hoping, you fill up the experience bucket before, you run out of rocks.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you're going on these peaks without too much experience, you're basically going, you're just counting on the luck bucket. You don't have the experience bucket.
Yeah.
And luck, unfortunately, doesn't run out by degrees, but all at once.
Yeah. Too bad.
Yeah.
So you've done Everest, Makalu. Any ambitions to do the rest? The 14?
Not all 14. It's nobody's looking to sponsor, mediocre middle-aged white guys to go to the Himalaya. Plenty of us have already kind of gone up there and climbed. So, unless I can flog like a cholesterol drug or some sort of like erection drug, I don't think I'm going to get sponsorship to go up there. For me, it's just as long as I have a crew of good friends or some commercial opportunities where I'm actually working up there, I'm happy to keep going. But it's all about the people I'm climbing with.
Yeah.
And so we've got a trip planned to Dhaulagiri, which is, I think, the 7th highest peak. for September.
Yeah.
So we're
Of
putting
this year.
for this coming year. So we're putting together a team of mostly of friends with a few clients coming along to offset some of the costs. And so I'll start training for that. And then, we'll see what happens next. We had planned to do K2 in 2020. That got scrapped because of COVID. And then other factors came into play that prevented us from doing it the next 2 years. But, we're kind of looking ahead to 2023 and thinking if Dhaulagiri goes well, then we might try to put the band back together and do organize another K2 trip.
How would you train? Is it like weight training, cardio, climbing other mountains?
I used to say I love training for these things because 8,000 meter climbing is it's a completely unique endeavor in the sense that if you run a marathon, like let's say you run Boston or New York or whatever, like the course is the course. It's the same. Okay, the weather changes and whatnot, but you're training for that basically to perform on your best day.
Yeah.
You've slept a lot, you've trained, you've rested, you eat your pasta dinner, whatever, you have your crew with support. Mountaineering is completely opposite. Like you basically have to train for your worst day.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be up there. You're probably going to have some sort of respiratory disease. You won't have slept very well. You won't be eating because you don't have appetite. In Everest, we climbed up to Camp 3. I was brewing some instant noodles when the Sherpa said, let's go, because we all kind of were confused on the time. And so, I had, I think that day, like a packet of oatmeal and like Cliff, some sort of energy gel and like a Cliff bar. And that was it. And that was my calories for the day before, venturing off on this thing. Hadn't slept at all that night, or there was no night. I mean, that day. So essentially it was like a 48-hour, just kind of sufferfest going on.
That's mental.
And it was fine, but you have to train for that. So for me, when I was training for that trip for Everest, I got the flu and I was so excited because I was like, this is great. Now I actually get to go try to run 15 miles, just like basically exuding, mucus from my mouth and nose. It's the most disgusting thing in the world. And I feel like absolute crap, but like, it's not going to be any easier up there. So, for anybody looking for training tips, just find adversity and train into it. Train at night, train after not sleeping, train without eating. Like you've really got to kind of put your body in those situations where, it's already primed not to perform and then you force it to work. But if you kind of take all these like, energy drinks and gels and stuff and always feel good and like, okay, now I'm hydrated. I have my carbohydrate loading from the night before. Now I'll go run 20 miles. Like, it ain't going to be like that on Everest.
What about diet? Is there anything specific you'd suggest?
Not really. A lot of people say that you should put on weight before 8,000 meter peaks. That's generally debunked. Basically speaking, any extra weight, whether it's muscle or fat, consumes oxygen. And that's just going to retard your acclimatization. So most people advise going in as lean and as light as you can. And so for that same reason, you want to target your weight training. So if you're doing, bench presses, that's not going to help on Everest because you're just building up pectoral muscle. You have to wait till it wastes away anyway before you acclimatize. So just tons of cardio, tons of kind of resistance training, targeting the legs. And then it just depends on the peak. Like if you're doing Everest from the north, that you have a 25 kilometer section between a base camp and ABC that you're going to have to get through. So at that point, if you're just doing like high intensity training and not, long endurance training, you won't be that prepared for it. So you kind of have to look at the route and structure your training. Whereas some peaks tend to be like relatively short bursts of energy, and you could definitely just do high intensity training. And that would probably suffice. Other ones, you have to do like really extensive training along the way. But yeah, once upon a time, I used to always maintain a good level of fitness because I was in the mountains. Now it's not the case. So now, I really need to give myself like a good 6 months before an expedition to get back in shape.
So like for these climbs, is it, I hear sometimes like when you're in high altitude, you're not supposed to eat meat. So is it better to be vegetarian on these high mountains or you can just eat anything?
It's a good question. Vegans really, really suffer up there, first of all, just because it's very hard, whether it's Everest North or South, to cater to a vegan diet. Vegetarians do okay, but still, like, you really have to be able to get enough protein in. Generally speaking, at base camp, whether it's south at 5.3 or north at 5.1, your body can repair tissue damage. So you do want to have like a fairly protein-rich diet, to rebuild all the damage that you've incurred up there. But as you said, Kip, like, the mainstay is going to be carbohydrates, just because the body digests those much more easily. So whether that's fruit, whether that's, starches like pasta, rice, potatoes, whatever, that's what's going to be the mainstay of your diet. All that said, if you're spending a month in base camp and let's say 20 of those days are going to be in base camp and 10 are going to be spent on the mountain, nobody wants to spend 20 days eating, just straight ugali or mashed potatoes or whatever. So it really does make a difference in terms of your morale and your motivation if you have like actually a good menu and you have steak night or chicken or whatever. So most expeditions actually will bring in, fresh produce and meat, just because it makes a difference. And again, if you're sitting in base camp all day long, you have one thing to look forward to, and that's dinner. Yeah. So if dinner sucks, then the trip probably sucks.
What about drinking up there?
Lots of schools have thought of that. Yeah. I mean, again, my approach is if I'm going to spend, 20, 30 days in a place, I want to enjoy myself. And for me, that means having a few beers. You probably don't want to, get on the piss every night up there. Not to say we didn't, but you make it a kind of exceptional thing. By the way, Russians are the most dangerous thing you could encounter up there because they have a lot of holidays in April and May. They have their May 5th, Victory Day from World War II. Okay. So if you're near Russians, you're going to get absolutely blind drunk on Everest. So just as an aside, just watch out for that. But otherwise, some wine, some beer, it doesn't hurt. What most people will say is, look, beyond base camp, you're not drinking. If you're carrying a flask up to Camp 1 on Everest, you probably have pretty deep-seated issues at that point, and you're probably not going to make it. But, again, it's all about having fun and not taking yourself too seriously. Keeping in mind what you're doing. But, again, life's too short to sit in base camp and be a teetotal vegan, I think.
Yeah. What's the number one snack that you must have? Like, for me, it's lollipops.
Lollipops?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, those are great because any sort of hard candy that you suck on tends to, you just swallow a lot, so it's really good for your throat. Yeah. So I always carry like a few Jolly Ranchers or something just so I can kind of, generate,
What's that? The jelly?
Just like a hard boiled sweet.
Okay.
Something to, to put in the mouth. But, man, for me, I'm not really wedded to anything. I mean, essentially on mountains, it's when I eat all the crap that I can't ever possibly eat down low, such as oatmeal, peanut butter, like things that Snickers bars, things that I would like never ever eat at sea level. Like that's the stuff I have up there.
Okay. All right. So you've done 4 of the 7 summits. Would you like to complete the other 3?
Notionally, yeah. I mean, I'd love to do Denali at some point. I'd only do it with friends because I think it's too much work to guide. Just because, you're carrying sleds, you're digging snow cave, like it's just a ton of work. So it would be a great friends trip to do. Mount Vinson down in Antarctica, I'd love to do, but I think it's only going to happen if somebody pays me to guide it. So Mark Gunlogson, if you're listening. And then lastly is, I don't even know, because people debate what the 7th summit is, or the last of the 7.
Australia or the other one.
Yeah, because in Australia, it's like some 300-foot ski hill, which dogs walk up every day, so it's not very complicated. It's like you go up, you climb, and you're in the pub by noon. Yeah. So if that was it, I'd love to go do that. The more complicated one, I can't even remember the name of it now, but it's
Jaya.
Yeah, on Iranian Jaya. Karsten's Pyramid on Iranian Jaya, and that one is very, very expensive. Basically, you have Freeman McMahon Road, the gold mining company that oppresses all the local people, and so they control access to it. And so whenever they're cracking down on the locals who get uppity, they close the mountain so they can kind of massacre everybody, and nobody's there to see it and put it on Instagram. So that one's a bit more complicated. But yeah, I mean, it would be a fun thing to complete. But these days, it's funny how it changes, right? Like the 7 summits. When I started guiding in the the late 1990s, early 2000s, that's what everybody wanted to do. It was the 7 summits.
Yeah.
And now it's the Explorers Grand Slam where. What is it? You climb Everest, and then you go to the North and the South Pole all in the same year.
Plus the poles, yeah.
So, the ante's definitely been up. So again, mediocre white guy, middle-aged white guy isn't going to impress anybody doing the 7 summits anymore.
We didn't talk about where you're from.
I'm from the U.S. I grew up in Vermont, a relatively obscure state in the Northeast near the Canadian border. Notable because it has the highest number of breweries per capita of any state in America. So Vermont rules. But yeah, and I've been living abroad for most of my adult life.
And now you're in Kenya.
Now I'm in Kenya and eating way too much Nyama Choma and drinking too much 254 Sandtrap beer, but loving it. It's a great place, and it's nice to kind of live somewhere where everything's new and you're kind of, every day I learn something new, whether it's, a new political figure's name, and there are a lot of them, or a new Sheng or Swahili word. So, I love it. I can't get enough of this place.
Karibu sana.
Asante sana, Buddha.
So for our next segment, it's going to be like a answering your questions segment. So I'd asked my followers if they have any questions for you. I didn't say you in specific. I just said like what your history is. And I'm just going to read it out. So let's see.
Definitely should pour some more beer for this one, because who knows? We're going to have to make up some questions if nobody sent any.
Okay, there they are. Okay, first question. How do you deal with altitude sickness?
In terms of my susceptibility to it, I do pretty well. I've had it pretty bad once on Aconcagua and once on a 6,000 meter peak in Nepal called Cholatse, when I couldn't breathe because I had so much fluid in my lungs or mucus.
Okay.
To the point where I was seriously considering doing a cricothyrotomy, basically cutting a slit in my throat because I just couldn't get air into my lungs. It was one of the most terrifying, kind of minutes of my life. I'd just be coughing, trying to almost like choking on something, but you can't cough it up. So that was terrifying. And I got back down to base camp and was completely blue. I was cyanotic due to lack of oxygen. But, it was fine. By the time I got back down to base camp, I took some antibiotics and recovered. So I haven't had any really, really bad cases up high, at least. I generally don't take Diamox prophylactically. I find that I generally acclimatize pretty well. I'm not anti-Diamox. I think, if people are and know they are susceptible to altitude illness, it makes perfect sense to take it before they go or once they arrive. For me, I like to feel how I'm doing. And that's one thing. I'll just jump back. A piece of advice for anybody is understand a bit of altitude, because, it's not something most of us know much about, because why would we? But, a common misconception is, it's a low oxygen environment. Well, no, it's not. There's 21% oxygen on the summit of Everest, just like there is right here in this room. The difference is the partial pressure of oxygen is a lot less on the summit of Everest, about a third of what it is on sea level. So when you breathe in, there are fewer molecules. So percentage same, amount you get is different. And if you can understand just basic kind of physiological things like that, then I think understanding the risks of it and how you approach it are much more. So, there's a great book by Charles Houston called Going Higher, The Story of Man in Altitude. And it talks about a lot of the early experiments they did in the 60s and 70s. And then there's a vast literature, of course, but that's a great one, well written. But yeah, so for me, I don't really have too many problems with it, but I always do carry a full kit because, again, with altitude illness, you don't really know when it's going to strike. I've been feeling good and then had it come out of nowhere. And it's one of those things that we call kind of an insidious disease or a disorder, in the sense that once you're suffering from it, it's hard to be aware that you are.
Yeah.
So it's important to have a buddy who also knows how to read the signs and symptoms and say, hey, look, Kip, you're not doing good. Because especially with things like cerebral edema, it affects your brain. And the acronym is you become a dickhead, disoriented, irritable, and combative. But if you're any of those things, you're probably not really aware of it. So it's good to have somebody to be like, hey, man, something's going on here. Check, let's maybe take some meds or go down or whatever it is.
And these meds are the Diamox.
The three main things you carry besides oxygen, the basic quiver for kind of altitude illness that you carry is dexamethasone, Diamox, nifedipine, which is a drug you use to treat pulmonary edema when the lungs start to fill up with fluid. And then you'll often carry oxygen, almost always carry oxygen. I mean, you carry it even on Kilimanjaro typically. And then a Gamoff bag, which is an inflatable bag where you can use like a bike pump to pump it up and lower the air pressure, or increase the air pressure rather. So it basically lowers your effective elevation by potentially a few thousand feet. And so it can stabilize the patient who you can't get out right away. And then you can carry it like a litter or whatnot.
Okay. So a second question is, which is harder, Makalu or Everest?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered that one a
Yeah.
bit. I would probably say Makalu. And the other thing is, Everest is a well-oiled machine. You know, there is a huge industry around climbing Everest. There's a lot of money that comes in. And so on either side, the Nepalese or the Tibet side, they don't screw around with it. You know, the icefall doctors get there early in the season. They get the icefall fixed with the ladders, all those pictures you've seen from the films. They get the route fixed to the summit. They maintain it. They're there till the season ends, and then they break it down. On the other peaks, kind of like I was mentioning with some of these commercial companies, they may show up and fix it, but they might not. So, for example, on Makalu, nobody had fixed the route to the summit. So we got up early and did it. So I was out with the Sherpas fixing rope that morning to the top. And we actually had to stop at one point because the rope fixers were still going up. And, you know, if the rope's not fixed,
Can't go.
you don't want to go up unless you're going to be attached to a rope. And so my eyeballs froze sitting there because we were in this wind. And I was too lazy to take my goggles out. And so that was another interesting one. Not as bad as the Imboro, but yeah, still, it was a bit more painful in the end, I think. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, so it's just like it was very challenging start to finish, and it was my first one, you know, first 8,000 meter peak, and kind of like I was saying with the training, one weird thing about 8,000 meter peaks is you're up there for maybe, I don't know, like 8, 12, 20 hours at most on an expedition, and then you're down. You know, so you basically spend all this time training to go kind of into space, and then you're in space for a really short time, and then you come down. So like, you really have to maximize your time up there to understand things. So like, I kind of view it as like a kind of science experiment. So like when I'm above 8,000 meters, I'm constantly like, how am I feeling? How does this work? How do I react to this food? But you have a really, really small window to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't for you, because you get tons of advice. Like, you know, I've given tons of advice here, and it probably wouldn't work for a lot of people, but, you know, it's based on my sort of limited windows in that environment. But then you come down, and then suddenly you're like, oh, okay, well, now here I am at 6,000 meters, and it doesn't really matter, you know, what I do, because it's relatively low compared to 8,500 meters. So yeah, you really kind of have to spend your time figuring it out. And I think on your first 8,000 meter peak, you're very much sort of, you're a novice, you know, you're really figuring out. Even me, I had done about 8, you know, trips up to 7,000 meters before I did my first 8,000 meter peak. You know, the difference was huge, just trying to figure it out. So I think on Everest, I kind of had some systems wired in a little better. I kind of knew, like, you know, my system for climbing fixed rope, I was more familiar with it. It was better. So there's lots of little tricks you learn, but again, you have like a relatively small window, a small opportunity to practice them, and then you're back down. So for me, yeah, definitely Makalu.
Definitely harder. So would you do anything different in terms of climbing? Like your past experience, what you've done so far?
I probably would. I mean, as a guide, look, I'm a dinosaur, you know. When I started...
How old are you?
I'm 48, which, you know, I'd like to think isn't that old overall, but, you know, for a high-altitude mountaineering and guiding, it's getting there. I mean, look, there's an 83-year-old guy who's trying to do Dalagiri right now, this Spanish guy, Carlos, and he's like, it's his last, it's the 14th peak of the 8,000-meter peaks. Yeah, but this is like his 4th or 5th attempt on it, you know.
Okay.
And it's hard to climb when you're 83, so, you know, I feel bad bitching because I'm 48, but I mean, all that said, like, things slow down, you know. It's kind of a younger person's game for sure. All that said, I mean, as a guide, yeah, like guiding's completely different now. Everybody's much more professional. They do the formal training, the UIAGM, the international guide standards. So, if I were starting out guiding now, I'd probably try to pursue that. Because when I started, it was just like, oh, you're an experienced climber. You know what you're doing? Great. Go out there and take clients up. But you didn't really have much formal training. But now you go through courses. It's a lot more professionalized, and the industry's better off for it. Guides are better done. For me, I mean, I think the simple answer is I just wish I'd done more climbing. Life gets in the way sometimes, but, sometimes you just have to say, the hell with it. Let's go climbing.
Yeah. Is there a mountain that's currently on your bucket list?
Dalagiri is for a while. I mean, I like aesthetic mountains, and
It's beautiful.
it is pretty beautiful. It's got this kind of very nice conical summit. It doesn't have like an obvious weakness like a lot of mountains. So the way to the top is kind of on these 35, 40 degree, very avalanche prone slopes. So there's not such an obvious point of weakness there. So you definitely kind of have to earn your summit on Dalagiri. But I mean, I think like a lot of other people, to me, like K2 is just like the peak of mountain aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful there, and then on top of that, all the history and everything else. Dalagiri is the more realistic one. But again, I'd like to kind of get back in practice, back in shape to the point where I feel like K2 would be a kind of reasonable goal to take on.
And it's a question that I've asked, but like, what's the general feeling having successfully summited Everest?
It was great because when we were there, my buddy Phil, and it's his company that I work for on the 8,000 meter peaks, and it's not a guide service; it's more of like an expedition facilitation service. And so I kind of come along as just sort of an assistant facilitator, as it were. But he gives a great speech before Everest, and he said, "Look, guys, like probably, the significance of it isn't going to be apparent when we're back here in base camp in a few days." He's like, "It's going to be later on in life when you're sitting around, maybe you're having a shitty day or you're feeling bad about yourself, and you might just come to an ad and have a picture of Everest." You'd be like, "Oh, wow, I've been up that thing." Or you just kind of flash back to a moment when you're in the tent at Camp 3 and you watch the sunset, and the lights changing and the clouds coming up the Khumbu Valley. You think like, okay, that's something not too many people get to see, and I kind of earned it, and that was fun. So, I just think it's something you don't appreciate necessarily when you're doing it. Certainly we didn't by virtue of doing it at night and having a kind of good understanding of the hazards involved in getting down. But I think it's something subsequently you reflect on. And, it's really cool. My wife and I just, we both trekked up Kilimanjaro in March. And I already see her, like whenever she sees a picture of it, she'll say, "We climbed that," and it's
and
funny.
submitted.
Yeah, but and it was her first kind of mountain that she went up. And, to me, that's awesome. Like, whenever we see it in a film now, she's like, "Hey, look, Kilimanjaro, we were up there." And, I definitely feel that way sometimes with Everest or, less often Makalu because you don't see it very often. But, I like to reflect on that. And then just the whole experience, too, that went along with it. The friendships I made, the people I spent time with, the brawl we had in base camp, whatever it was, it's a very, very positive memory.
And like in Everest, there's an Everest database.
Yep.
So every single summiter is there. I found that interesting. So, is he still climbing or has he hung his boots? Of course, you're obviously continuing.
Still continuing, but I have to say it's not Kenya's fault, it's mine. But, when I was doing a lot of my other climbs, I was living in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a much better place to train for 8,000 meter climbing than Kenya because there's no fatty food and there's no alcohol. So you're basically like a monk with a treadmill. There's nothing to do. You can't like go walk around the streets or anything. You're just sort of locked up. So, obviously not anymore, but once upon a time, Afghanistan was like the perfect training ground for 8,000 meter peaks for me because it was just such a joyless experience. Like there was nothing else to do. Whereas like there's way too much fun to be had in Kenya to like, for somebody as undisciplined as me to, to completely remain focused on it. So, I'll often be like, okay, I'm going to get on the rower for a couple thousand meters, and somebody calls and is like, hey man, I am a choma. Yeah, shit, let's go get some choma.
Actually, talking about the Afghanistan, I read on your bio, you got like an award for, you create a new route, or was it attempting a new route?
That's the second podcast, I think. No, that was a disaster. My partner didn't get the right visa, so we couldn't actually come into Afghanistan. So we ended up trying to climb some like rinky-dink peak in Tajikistan and couldn't even get up that. So, and we stopped talking midway through the expedition, and it didn't go well. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Story for another day.
Then a quick question for you. So what's your next Himalayan trip going to be? Considering that's kind of our link is, having met in the Khumbu.
So we met, so I did Everest base camp trek. Right now I want to do a 6,000 meter mountain. So I'm seeing maybe like Mera Peak. Mm-hmm. That seems like a good one that I'd like to do.
Yep.
And hopefully end of the year. And then next year, I don't know, we'll see. 7,000, 8,000.
Awesome.
We'll see.
Let's go climbing together in Nepal, brother.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
So. And that has been episode 2 of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Ted, for coming. Cheers.
Kip, thanks to you and the Hueva crew here for everything. Appreciate it. It was a good experience. My first podcast, so I hope I didn't screw it up too badly.
No, it was good. Okay, see you on the next one. All right, that was good. How long was